7th Standard Science Unit 5 Reproduction and Modification in Plants. In this part we are going to learn about pollination. We have already learned that pollination is important for fruit formation and seed formation. If we have to learn pollination, we must know the male and female reproductive parts of a flower. This is a flower. Androecium is the male reproductive part. It is made up of stamens. This flower has 6 stamens. Gynoecium is the female reproductive part. It has basal ovary and slender style and the end part stigma. The pollen grains are displayed here. What we see here are pollen grains. Pollen grains are produced inside the stamens. This is not the actual size of pollen grains. Actual size of pollen grain is 1000 times smaller than what we see here. These pollen grains are produced inside the stamens. A stamen has 2 regions, the basal long slender part filament and the upper part anther. Each anther is filled with millions of pollen grains. The anther is filled with pollen grains. Anther is filled with pollen grains. This pollen grain has to be deposited on the stigma. Thereby pollination can happen. This is stigma. The pollen grain has to be transported and deposited on the stigma. The transportation of pollen grain is done by wind, water and various insects. Now let us see how pollination takes place. The pollen grain moves and falls on the stigma by any one of the various means. This process is called as pollination. Transfer of pollen grain from anther to the stigma of a flower is called pollination. What is pollination? The transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma is called pollination. Have you ever seen butterflies and insects, various insects visiting flowers? You would have seen. Why do they visit flowers? They visit flowers for their food. The flowers produce a sugary substance called as nectar. To get nectar, the insects visit flowers. While visiting flowers, they sit on the flowers. At that time, the pollen grains stick on their legs and abdomen and wings. While visiting another flower, they deposit the pollen grains. Insects carry pollen grains from one flower to another flower. An insect helps in pollination. Insect visits a flower, the pollen grain sticks on its legs. The insect visits another flower and sits on the flower. At that time, the pollen grains stick on its legs, fall on the stigma. In this way, pollination takes place. Let us see what is self-pollination. This is the red color anther lobe. It produces pollen grains. The pollen grain of the anther falls on the stigma of the same flower. Anther produces pollen grains. The pollen grain falls on the stigma of same flower. This is called as self-pollination. Transfer of pollen grain from anther to stigma of the same flower is called self-pollination. Then what is cross-pollination? This is flower A and this is flower B. From flower A, pollen grains are carried and deposited on the stigma of flower B. This type of pollination is called as cross-pollination. What is cross-pollination? Transfer of pollen grain from one flower to the stigma of another flower of another plant is called as cross-pollination. From flower A, anther is carried and deposited on flower B of another plant. This is called as cross-pollination. Let us see again what is cross-pollination in detail. Cross-pollination is common in unisexual flowers. Cross-pollination is common in unisexual flowers. We have already learned in the previous video what are unisexual flowers. This is male flower, it is produced in male plant. Another one is female flower, it is produced in female plant. Male plant produces pollen grains. From male plant, the pollen grains are carried to the female flower. Thereby cross-pollination takes place. And insect visits the male flower. From male flower, it carries pollen grains, and while sitting on the female flower, it deposits pollen grain on the stigma. This type of pollination is cross-pollination. Wind also helps in pollination. How? The wind shakes the plant, so pollen falls, and the wind also carries the pollen grains. In the right diagram we can find white cloud of pollen grains carried by wind. Water also helps in pollination. Water current carries the pollen grains in aquatic plants. Bees help in pollination. Butterflies help in pollination. Birds, variety of birds help in pollination. Bees, butterflies, birds, wind and water are called as pollinating agents or agents of pollination. The agents that are help in pollination are called pollinators. Bees, butterflies, birds are pollinators. So we will learn the differences between self-pollination and cross-pollination in the next part.